Alright, today's video is all about compression. Today we're going to cover all the major controls on a compressor and show you how to use them. And we're also going to do it while weaving in and out of the four main styles of compression: FET, VCA, OPTO, and the VMU tube compressors. We're going to cover all that today, so hopefully by the end of the video you'll have a way better idea of how compressors work, how to dial them in to get the tone that you want, and which compressor to reach for the job. So let's dive right into it. So one of the main reasons I like to use this TB bus compressor is because it has this nice visual aid for us here. We can really see the threshold engaging and the ratio, and it has all of the controls that most stock compressors have. Now we're going to start with talking about the threshold. The threshold is basically the imaginary line that you set so that any amplitude that crosses the line starts to get compressed. And the more you reduce the threshold into the waveform, the more of the information in the waveform will begin to be acted upon by the compressor. Now, if you just engage the threshold a little bit, you'll just engage the peak of the waveform, which on a hi-hat is super easy to hear because it's just the initial transient click. So by engaging the threshold here, you can see that we've started to get some gain reduction. And if I drop the threshold way down till it's really engaging more of the middle of the waveform, which would be the decay and sustain part of the waveform, now we're getting a whole bunch of gain reduction. So that's what the threshold is the imaginary line that you set that tells the compressor what to go to work on. Anything that's going to cross the threshold is going to be compressed. Now the ratio is how hard the compressor is pushing the information above the threshold back down to it. So right now I have a ratio of 4:1, which is pretty gentle. And you'll see if I back the ratio all the way off to 1:1, there's no compression happening anymore. And that's what the ratio of 1:1 means. Nothing's happening. And when you increase the ratio dramatically, this one goes all the way up to 10:1, which is approaching the limiter function. That's a really, really hard squash of anything over the threshold back down to it. Now, modest ratios are considered typically 4:1, and if you don't need any more than 2:1 or 3:1, then that's a great sound. You can crank it up as high as you need to, but the harder you work the compressor, the more you're going to hear the compressor working, and we'll get to more of that later. Now, if I decrease the ratio, so I'm getting much less gain reduction, but I also bring the threshold further down and further down, now I'm compressing the entire hi-hat, but I'm doing it very gently. Conversely, if I were to raise the threshold to where it's just engaging with the peak, with a very gentle ratio, now I'm just engaging the transient of the hi-hat and pushing it back down to the threshold just a little bit. But if I crank the ratio up here, I'm pushing it back down to the threshold very hard. So that's the flexibility between the threshold and the ratio. It's how much do you engage the sound and how hard do you push it back down. Now, one of the ways that I like to get to know a compressor and really hear what the threshold and ratio interplay is doing is to put it on something with a lot of information like a drum bus. That way we have something with a lot of transients and a lot of color and a full spectrum. So let's go ahead and do that and dial in the threshold and ratio so we can really hear what it's doing. So I have a pretty slow attack. I have this set at 150 and a pretty slow release. This is set at 200. And I start with the ratio at about 4:1, and then I just start to engage the threshold and listen to that imaginary threshold line go down and down further into the signal and kind of listen to what it's doing to the transients and the overall gain reduction that I'm getting out of it. So let's engage the threshold and take a listen. Back it off. On most buses, you're only looking for a couple dB of gain reduction, so anything down in here is probably not what you're after, but it's still cool to just dial it in farther than you would need so you can really hear the effect and kind of get to know your compressor that way. Now I'm going to go ahead and crank the ratio up to 8:1. Now back the threshold off. And now let's try a VMU compressor on this drum bus. This is typically what we think of when we think of a tube compressor. Now, lots of other compressors can have tubes in them, but with the VMU compressors, they're actually using the tube to do the compression. And you'll notice here that there's no threshold, no ratio, no attack, and no release. This is what's called program-dependent compression. So as you drive the signal into the compressor, it engages the threshold and ratio and attack and release in its own way. It does its own thing. So all you have to do is drive the signal in to engage it, and then where it says gain, that's effectively makeup gain. So you just set the gain to level match. Tube compressors, these VMUs, they are designed to give a lot of color. So it's going to impart its own tone and its own character to the drum bus. These are one of these kind of compressors that are not really designed to handle peak transients, but it doesn't mean that they don't sound awesome on peaks and transients because they color them, but it just doesn't take the place of a limiter. So if this drum bus had a whole bunch of peaks that we needed to get under control, I would suggest putting a limiter on first and then using your tube compressor to give your color and your groove and your glue. So let's go ahead and drive this thing into this tube compressor and see how it sounds. Do a little makeup gain. We drive it a little harder. Now right away you can hear how it really fattens up the kick drum, and it's giving a nice texture to the high end. These VMUs are very cool. They can sound good on buses, they're really nice on vocals, and they're really good for providing that glue that we want from a compressor. Let me back this off. That's a little more than I would want if I was trying to color this drum bus. But just a hint of it there, I think that sounds really nice. But I mainly just wanted to show you this in case you have any of these plugins that don't have all of the controls that most compressors have. That's how they work. They're called program dependent. So you just drive the signal in, do a little makeup gain, and see if you like the sound. If not, you just pull it and try a different compressor. Now this is an LA2A, this is La from Analog Obsessions, and it kind of works the same way. You just turn it on, drive it in, and see if you like it. This is an OPTO compressor. It has a built-in soft knee, so it's really good for vocals, it's really good on bass, and it's also not great for doing the job of a limiter, but it sounds really good on peaks if you're trying to color your transients. So this knob here that says peak reduction, this is just your input signal driving it in, and gain is effectively makeup gain. So this is also program dependent, so as you drive the signal in, the threshold and ratio just go to work for you. And again, this has its own kind of color and style, and you just turn it on, get a little gain reduction, and see if you like it. This one does have some other sidechain options. You know, if I wanted to take this up to 150 hertz here on the high pass, and now this is no longer responding primarily to the kick drum. Get up a little higher. And now we can probably drive it a little harder. A little more makeup gain. And I'll bypass it. And back on. Yeah. I think that has a really nice warm sound, and it gives us a little bit of that glue. These can sound really, really nice. Now let's talk about the attack on a compressor. This can be kind of confusing, especially to newer engineers, because you might think that if you crank up the attack, you'll get more attack out of your sound, and it's kind of the opposite. The attack on a compressor is measuring the time that it takes for the compressor to go to work on anything that has crossed the threshold. So a faster attack time means the compressor is engaging faster, and a slower attack time means it takes longer for the compressor to engage on any of that sound that has crossed the threshold. So with a high transient instrument like a hi-hat, If I do a really fast attack time, what you're going to hear is the initial transient of the hi-hat get reduced to the point where the hi-hat sounds much more insignificant and more in the distance or in the background, and definitely a lot less bright. So there's the attack all the way at 0, and you can hear that a lot of the sound of the hi-hat is kind of gone. The initial transient has been all but cut out. Now, as you start to back the attack off and more of the transient comes through, you'll hear the snap of the hi-hat as all that transient starts to shine through again. And two really important tips about that. It's easier to hear your attack time and what it's doing if you turn your listening volume down quite a bit. If you get to a quieter reference monitor volume, you'll be able to hear the effects of the attack really easily. And another thing is the attack time is not something you want to set in solo. It's something you want to set in the context of the mix, and let me show you why. So here's a VCA compressor on this piano. Now, some VCAs are very colorful and impart a lot of tone and character. This one doesn't. This one's really transparent. And so we got a ratio of 4:1. We got the threshold just engaged a little bit, so you can see on the meter we got about 2 to 4 dB of gain reduction. So what we're going for here is to just use the compressor for just a nice leveling, where we can quiet down the loud stuff a little bit and make the quieter stuff a little louder so the piano cuts through the mix better. You'll also notice this compressor does not have an attack and release. Now you'll see down here where it says envelope. This is the giveaway here. The milliseconds is the faster of the two, so that's your attack. If you ever see this where you don't have an attack and release, one of these two knobs is going to be attack and one's going to be release, and the release is going to be the one that operates over a longer period of time. And like I said at the beginning, the ADSR, attack, decay, sustain, release, that's the envelope. So the compressor's doing dynamic signal processing, and it's changing the dynamic envelope of the waveform. So if you ever see this, that's what it means. Now let's hear this in the mix, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to speed the attack up from its slowest to its fastest, and you'll be able to listen to the transients go away, and basically the piano is just going to get lost in the mix because the piano's a percussive instrument, and if we're not letting through any of that transients, then it just kind of becomes a background instrument. All right, here we go. See, we've really pushed the piano to the background. Let's go back to our slowest attack. And now it's back up more towards the foreground. This is where you get in with the attack and decide how much transient you want to let through, which is affecting the brightness of the piano, but it's also affecting how far back it sits in the mix. Now let's do one more example here. This time we're going to compress the guitar, but we're going to use a FET compressor. And this 1176 is famous for being super fast. The attack is really fast. So let's see how this fast attack affects this guitar. So you can hear when we engage it that it's clamping down on those transients, and it's giving it a lot of punch and texture and color. And you can also hear that the wah part of the guitar behind the hard scraping of the pick is nice and accented by this. Let's hear it in the mix. Now listen to what happens when I take the attack time from fast down to slow. And back to fast. Yeah, you can really hear the difference. With the faster attack time, the guitar disappears in the mix, and with the slower attack time, it pops back out. Let's do that again. That's very nice, and this is with a ratio of 8:1. Yeah, since that's such a percussive, chunky guitar sound, it's almost gone with the fast attack time. And these FET compressors have super fast attack times measured in microseconds. So hardly any of the transient is coming through, which is why the guitar is no longer very bright at all and why it sounds like it's been pushed to the background. Slow that attack time back down. And that brings the guitar right back to the front. And now let's talk about the release. The release is going to dramatically affect the sustain and the decay. If you watch the gain reduction right in here, what the release does is control how fast the compressor recovers. So right now I have it at 150 milliseconds, which is a fairly slow release. Now let's go ahead and turn the release all the way up to its fastest. So now the compressor is recovering very fast. After the initial compression, the release is letting go very quickly. And if I increase the release, you'll see that slow down. And now you'll see that the release is barely back to the threshold before the next sound hits. If you set the release too slow, the compressor won't fully come back to its 0 mark before the next sound hits. If the release is too slow, you're basically not using the compressor anymore, you're just turning down the hi-hat. Slow releases are very useful and they have their place, but you just want to make sure you never go too slow. And what you typically want with the release setting is to have it recover completely back to the threshold before the next engagement of the compressor happens. Release can be one of the hardest ones to train your ear how to hear, and hi-hats are really good for that, especially this half-open hi-hat. So I'm going to go back and forth now between fast release and slow release. It almost makes the hi-hat sound like it's closing and opening. Pretty interesting, huh? The hi-hat is the same. It's not closing or opening anymore. It's just a sample on a loop. But that's a really good way to show your ears what the release is doing. And don't confuse the release on your compressor with the release on ADSR. The release on your compressor will also affect the sustain and the decay of the waveform. But now let's take a listen to one more example of attack and release. Here we got the 1176 on the drum bus. You can hear what it's doing to the kick is awesome. It's really warming up the ride. And I'm gonna speed up the attack time. Now it's a little darker. Let's hear this in the mix. And if I slow down the attack time, it'll make the drums sound like they're coming forward a little bit. If I slow down the release, we'll get a little bit more of that gluing effect. A little more bounce and groove. You drive it a little harder. You can hear how it gives us a little bit of that pumping effect because I have it cranked up pretty good. We're getting quite a bit of gain reduction. So let's move on to the knee. The knee is a very subtle effect, which is also hard to hear, but it's easy to see on this compressor. So take a look at the line, the way that it bends here as it hits the threshold, the X and Y axis of the line around the dot. I'm going to turn the knee up all the way to the other end. So you can see how it totally softened out and now there's a curve here. Take it all the way back. So this is a hard knee setting, which has a hard angle, which means the attack and the ratio are responding 100% to what they're supposed to do to the information that crosses the threshold. And all the way back to a soft knee means that the effects of the attack and the ratio are going to work a little more discreetly and a little more gently as if the line were being blurred. So a soft knee is very handy. A soft knee can give you a much gentler compression sound. But you might want a hard knee in a lot of situations where you really want the attack and ratio to react to anything over the threshold in a very immediate, aggressive fashion. It's almost easier to see the knee in action on this compressor than it is to hear it. So now we're going to decrease the attack time to let all of the transient through and increase the ratio from 4:1 to about 8:1. So we're getting a lot of compression. And now we're going to go back and forth from hard knee to soft knee on the hi-hat so you can hear the difference. With the hard knee, you hear a harder sound, and the transient is a little softer with the soft knee. And that's the idea. But yes, the knee is a subtle control, but it is very useful. Another one of the controls that you're going to see on compressors is the makeup gain. Now, this green light here is an automatic makeup gain. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off. You see how quiet the hi-hat got? That's because we're doing 10 or 11 dB of gain reduction. So when you engage a compressor, the makeup gain is there to bring the overall volume back. So this is like an output gain. So if you engage a compressor and everything just gets quieter, remember you have to use the output gain, usually called a makeup gain, to balance that out. Or you use the automatic makeup gain if your compressor has one. Now, the last control I want to talk about is the mix knob. This is for parallel compression, which basically means we can blend the original signal with the compressed signal. And most compressors these days have a mix knob, or it might be called a dry-wet knob. Whenever you see mix or dry-wet knob, not just on a compressor, but on anything, that's what it's for. It's for parallel processing. Right now, with it set to 100%, that means we're hearing 100% compressed signal, none of the dry signal. When I drag this to 0%, now we're just hearing the hi-hat without any of the compression. And then we can do a blend in between. So if I take it to about 50%, now we're hearing half of the dry original hi-hat and half of the compressed signal. That's parallel compression. And this has a lot of awesome applications. So let's use the mix knob on the 1176 to dial in some parallel compression. So if I were to bring in more of the dry signal, that's a nice blend there. So you have this over-compressed signal behind the original dry signal running in parallel. So that's a nice happy medium of the two. Let's go towards 75% compressed. So this way you can dial in a little more compression than might be necessary, and you can mess around with parallel compression and get a nice blend. And all the way back to fully compressed. But that's the idea. You can really over-compress a signal and then blend it back in and really get the best of both worlds. That's parallel compression. But there you go. That's the overview of all the controls and how they work and how you should go about dialing them in and listening for them. So I really hope all that helps. I hope the next time you grab a compressor, you have a better idea of which one to grab for which job and how to dial in those controls so you're not just turning knobs blind. And compression is one of those things that I feel like I am just always learning. There's just more and more to learn about compression. It's a really big world and there's a lot of nuance in it. I've listened to interviews like maybe you have too, where some of the really great famous engineers are picking each other's brains just about compression because people that have been doing hit albums over and over still feel like they don't understand compression inside and out. It is very complex. There's a lot to it, and everything we just went over is really just a cursory overview. I'm always learning as well. So let me know in the comments what your favorite compressors are for which jobs. Stay tuned for that video on the 1176 LA2A combo and more detailed videos on parallel compression. There's also multi-band compressors, which are really, really useful. So the compression world is really big, and we've kind of only scratched the surface, but I hope we did it in a really informative way that gives you a lot of tools and hopefully give you a lot more to go on. Thanks for checking that out, and hit me up in the comments, and I'll catch you on the next one.